And this is a slide showing where we're recasting it a little bit. Here I showed you inputs before. Now I'm talking about the net inputs, which means we're subtracting the net food and feed leaving the watershed from the inputs. And then we can relate this net anthropogenic nitrogen inputs to the only remaining outflow term, green flux. So that's the reason for that. So I'm going to take you through some of the components of nanny. I showed you what the inputs were, and I'll show you some figures for the United States and some other regions, just to give you an idea of the spatial variation of these things. This is some work we did recently. It was just published this year. This is the nitrogen fixation term of nanny, and as it varies across the U.S. And in the case of the U.S., it's mostly due to fixation by soybeans. And not surprisingly, in the breadbasket of the country, the big agricultural region of the U.S. is in the Mississippi Basin. That's where most of the soybeans are, and that's where most of the nitrogen fixation happens. Elsewhere, it's relatively minor. Fertilizer, the same sort of pattern. The corn belt, the corn is an extremely fertilizer-demanding crop. Most of the fertilizer, the nitrogen fertilizer that's applied, is applied in this region, the Mississippi Basin, where most of the corn is grown. There are other spotty areas. These areas are probably also mainly corn growing areas, some of which is associated with livestock production. They're growing corn to feed animals. Down here, it could be specialty crops, high-value vegetable crops, things like that. In contrast, the pattern for atmospheric deposition of nitrogen in the United States is quite different. We see a sort of an east-west gradient corresponding to arguably population. Why would that matter? Well, a lot of the atmospheric emissions of nitrogen are coming out of automobiles, and where there are people, there are automobiles, especially in the United States. So I think it's also true that there's a fair amount of emissions from power plants, but the same applies. So most of the atmospheric deposition is in the east. Even up here in the northeast, it's relatively low compared to down here in the Ohio Valley and places like that. But even though it's relatively low, it's still in an area like Maine, which has very little agriculture compared to the Midwest, and a relatively low population density. It's still the dominant source of nitrogen. This is the nitrogen in the net food and feed term, and this requires a bit of explanation. The blue, the dark blue, actually represents a negative term, which means that these regions are exporting nitrogen as food and feed. And if you think about that, again, it's the corn belt here. We're exporting a lot of our corn to places like China and other places, or possibly to other states where they're feeding cattle and pigs and things like that. So that's one thing. This area is a big exporter of nitrogen and food and feed. The red areas are places where there's a net input, and those tend to be small, patchy little areas. Why is that? They tend to correspond to urban areas where there are a lot of people, high demand for food, a lot of nitrogen being imported into the region to satisfy the demand for food. And there are other places like out here and here where there are no large urban populations, but there are large animal populations. For example, in southeastern Pennsylvania, they grow lots of pigs. And in parts of the Midwest, they grow lots of cows, and they feed them corn, often exported from someplace else. So intense, small, patchy areas associated with large numbers of livestock or people. And this is the overall. You sum up each of those terms and you get this sort of complicated pattern. Again, you see overall a large east-west gradient. Again, fairly low up here relative to down here. My take on this is it's mainly driven by population due to one reason or another. Getting back to the iPad equation, population is one of the big drivers here for a variety of reasons. Just to show you that we're not the only ones who use this methodology, this is from the recent European nitrogen assessment, a completely independent group working on a version of NANI for Europe. This is from chapter 16, showing a different scale here, but showing interesting regional variations. Scandinavia is relatively low. Not many people up here, not a lot of agriculture up here. There's agriculture in southern Sweden, but Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany have, and the UK in places have extremely high nitrogen inputs, net anthropogenic nitrogen inputs, most of which is associated with industrialized livestock production. The Danes are growing, I think, I'm not sure about this statistic, but I think they have more pigs than people in this part of Denmark. So lots of pigs and also lots of people. So together they represent a relatively high nitrogen demand. This is again some work that we did. This is the Baltic drainage basin in northern Europe. It roughly corresponds, if you look at the numbers on here, it roughly corresponds, it agrees to the numbers that Loicz analysis came up with. I wanted to point this out. This is on a log scale, so each of these colors represents a 10-fold increase of nitrogen over the other ones. So the red shows greater than 10,000 kilograms nitrogen per square kilometer per year. Again, this is Denmark with lots of pigs, and they're demanding lots of nitrogen in the food, in their feed rather. Let's see. This would be Germany and the Baltic states and things like that, sort of intermediate levels, and in northern Sweden and northern Finland, etc., relatively low levels. So keep these colors in mind because now we're switching to the United States. The same scale, log scale again. This is essentially the same thing that I just showed you, but on a different scale. Again, the pattern that I see here is big east-western gradient, little tiny patches of intense inputs corresponding to urban areas and intense areas of livestock production, and fairly light up in the northeastern corner where there aren't very many people. So it's interesting to look at these patterns and think about here's the real thing that blew my mind. This is China. Look at the size of these regions. Lots of people, lots of animal production to feed the people, lots of imported nitrogen in feed to feed the animals. Where is that coming from? Some of it's coming from the Mississippi and elsewhere. So I thought we had problems in the United States, but I'm not quite sure what this means. There may be some methodological differences that are responsible for this, but the data is from Chao Ku Ti, who's going to be here at the Open Science meeting presenting next week, and we can talk to her about it. I think she's done some excellent work and came out with a paper not too long ago describing a methodology similar to NANI. This is some work that we just had published this year for looking at the relationship between the nitrogen inputs to the watersheds and the riverine nitrogen flux coming out of the watersheds. Remember that mass balance I was showing you about. So these are measured, these are estimated, and we compare them and see what we've seen in all of the other studies that we've done before in various regions. A more or less linear relationship. Here there's a fair amount of scatter, but the salient feature is the slope of this line is about here it's about 0.24. Depending upon the analysis, I've seen 0.2, 0.15 to 0.3. What that means is for every unit of nitrogen coming into the watershed, about a quarter of it, 20%, 30%, is leaving in the river. So there are clearly consequences to our coastal waters for the activities that are putting nitrogen into these watersheds. Just coincidentally, I've got the data together to do the analysis for the some major watersheds in China that Xiao Kuti again provided. Here, the slope is 0.35 instead of 0.25. Why is this? Well, I'm not sure. There may be differences, fundamental morphological differences in the watersheds. These are typically larger watersheds than the ones we've studied, so that there may be a scaling factor, or it could be that the environmental standards in some of these watersheds are lower, so there's there may be methodological farm management practices that are different. I don't know, but it's an interesting. There aren't many data here, so that's one point. But the fact that this slope is higher means that per unit nitrogen going into the watersheds, we have a higher riverine load to the coast. That's problematic if it holds up. Consequences for coastal waters. Well, Loicz has been thinking about this for a long time. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because many of you know all about it already. But Loicz in the early 90s developed an approach to look at mass balances of coastal water bodies, budgets, in order to infer something about their coastal ecosystem metabolism. The original goal was, the main goal was to examine the effect of the coastal zone on the global carbon budget, but budgets have been using the Loicz methodology for many purposes since this document by Gordon et al. Came out in 1996. I won't take you through this except to say that the procedure, the methodology for the Loicz biogeochemical budget approach is somewhat similar to what I was describing for watersheds. Again, you measure inputs and outputs and infer what's going on inside, which can be interpreted as ecosystem metabolism, which has direct consequences for eutrophication and other things. It's easy to demonstrate that terrestrial nutrient loads and atmospheric nutrient loads can strongly affect these coastal nutrient budgets. It shows up every time we do a nutrient budget, it seems. There are direct implications for the role of coastal waters in the carbon budget, but also effects on hypoxia, eutrophication, changes in species composition, development of harmful algal blooms, for example, other impacts with associated damages to coastal resources and the economies that depend on them. There's also a lot of variation in the response of coastal ecosystems. As we discovered over the years in Loicz, various types of coastal water bodies in different parts of the world can respond quite differently to the same level of loading. So individual variation makes it problematic to be predictive about these things. And I should say that we're carrying on in development of the methodology. Eric Polanski and colleagues are trying to modify the approach to handle highly turbid systems for which the method was not originally developed. This is something which I picked up on the CNN website not too long ago, showing that those large nitrogen inputs to Chinese watersheds have consequences. It's actually making the news. And eutrophication is not the only thing. Dead zones, this is a paper by Diaz and Rosenberg from 2008. There are over 400 systems, hypoxic systems around the world that have been reported as of 2008 due to eutrophication from excessive nutrient loading primarily. So what does this tell us? The Anthropocene is here. I made a remark about the Homogocene when we were talking earlier today. The Homogocene is, has been defined as the effect of modern globalization and trade practices on the distribution of species, the homogenization of the gene pool, basically. But it also has effects on the nutrient cycles of the world. So we're increasingly connecting our different regions of the world via trade, and that's clear, increasingly clear. Population, affluence, and technology continue to be critical determinants of nutrient loading. We can address some of these, or try to understand some of these, using coastal accounting methods. These methods allow more meaningful cross-system comparisons and baseline comparisons for stakeholders. But what's critical is we must continue to monitor coastal waters and their watersheds in order to use these tools, synthesis tools. We can't make any progress if we choose not to observe the problems. So with that, I will end, and thanks very much to Loicz and its parent organizations. Thank you for your attention. And I also thank Bong Gi Hong and Chao Pu Ti for helping with this presentation. Thank you.